Hey friends, Jeff here with a new episode of Conversations Life Science Leaders Aren't Having. Today you're in for a real treat. It was a treat for me to be a part of the conversation with Aaron McHugh. Aaron is an executive coach and advisor to senior leaders and their teams all over the globe. He is author of the book Fire Your Boss and has a podcast called Work, Life, and Play. I've known Aaron for about 6 months, and who Aaron is to me is the word heart. Even as you listen to our conversation here in a few seconds, his heart is in everything he says. He is heartful in how he conveys his ideas. There's a kindness and a gentleness to how he talks about some really challenging things for us to take on. And while we don't even name the podcast in our conversation until the very end, everything that we talk about is a conversation or are conversations that leaders should, and if I dare say must, start having. I think you're really going to enjoy this conversation with Aaron McHugh. Aaron McHugh, welcome. I am so grateful to have you on the podcast and excited to dive into this conversation.
Yeah, thanks, Jeff. Thanks for having me on.
Aaron, you just heard me do a very brief introduction of you. Would love for you to start us off and let us know what you're up to in the world.
Yeah, I love to start that question with what I love to do, what are some of the things that are keeping me curious. These days here in Colorado, it just started snowing, so I got a pass and spent Saturday and Sunday out with some new skis. I've got a backcountry trip scheduled with some buddies, so I love to spend time outdoors of all kind in self-powered mode. So run, bike, climb, ski, swim, hike, fish, like anything that's outside. That's a big part of my life and passion and love, and a place that I really find I can recharge and just, I guess, make sense of the world that I find myself in. And then for me, family is a really big deal. My wife and I will be married 29 years this weekend, and our kids are now adults and from age 21 to 27. And that's a special time in our life where we're coming back together for the holidays to be able to gather around the table and talk about what each of us have been up to and what we're curious about, what we're enjoying, what we're finding challenging. So that's really special. And the work I do in the world, I find really special. I remember years ago, was in a car ride with a friend, and he's like, well, what would you really want to do? And I was like, I really want to coach CEOs. I was like, I don't even know what that was. He reminded me of it years later. And I was like, wow, talk about a not very well-founded idea or plan. But I think it was somewhere just deep in my soul that that really meant was I want to be in support of leaders up to interesting things in the world, facing challenges and complexity that are not simple or easy. And I want to partner with them and come alongside as a support, as an ally, as a disruptor to help them face those challenges in more human-centered ways.
Aaron, one of the ideas in your book, Fire Your Boss, is this concept of jumping fences or hopping over fences. I think recently in one of your Work, Life, Play podcasts, you literally jumped over a fence as you were recording the podcast. I'm curious, what's a fence that you're jumping over or have recently jumped over in your life?
Yeah, that's a great question. Yeah, that metaphor is this idea of going beyond the safe side out to the wilderness, right? Figuratively, literally the frontier, and exploring what's on the other side of the fence. I think that for me is probably, I've been exploring what are some of the long long held beliefs and narratives around how I make sense of my relationships, how I make sense of suffering, and how limiting some of the things I've learned to believe have really become for me in ways that were out of my view before. So that's a fence I've been hopping to see what's over there and what's a more liberated, grace-filled, maybe less managing life and more surrendering in life. What could that look like for me?
What have you found on the other side of the fence hop? I'm sure there's lots. So maybe.
Yeah, well, and one of it is like I'm a real selfish bastard sometimes, more than I knew. I had a little inkling of how self-centered some of my ways were, but now I'm really clear on how pervasive that is, and how a lot of my effort has gone into managing life and attempting to arrange for outcomes, influence people and things in ways that I'm keenly aware of and those closest to me are, that I find really fatiguing and super unhelpful. So it's like, I think in the Beatitudes, in the Message translation by Eugene Peterson, it's like, blessed is he who comes to the end of his rope. So I've been coming to the end of my rope.
I love the next sentence. At the end of your rope, there's less of you and there's more of God.
Yeah, totally. So I'm finding a whole lot less of me and a whole lot more invitation, for what God might be up to for me in terms of freedom and joy.
Well, you've opened up the veil on sort of the richness of who you are. So I'm gonna stay in that place with our 3 H's that we ask all of our guests on the show. And the 3 H's are hero, highlight, and hardship. You can go in whatever order you'd like.
Cool. And in each case, so who is a hero of mine as a starter?
Yes.
What's a hardship I'm facing? And then
or half-faced.
Yep. And then what's the
highlight?
Highlight. Okay, cool. All right, fun. All right, let's play with those. So maybe starting with hero. One of my heroes is, probably I'll add some new ones to this list. I really love Bono from U2. He is just a really curious fellow to me. And so I put him in that hero category. I'd like to share a pint with him. And what I love about him is, I heard an interview with him, and they said, how do you write these songs? And he said, I don't know. I don't know how I know how to. I just do. And he was being interviewed about what to do with the influence that he holds. And he said, I want to hold this influence for the benefit of others and not just the empire building for myself, basically. So it was really powerful. And he talked about, he was spending time with the poor in Africa. And the interviewer was asking, why do you spend time here? Like, pale-skinned Irishmen down in the hot heat of Africa. And he said, well, I want to be close to God. And God is always near the poor. So this is where I choose to be. So I find him super fascinating. I find Eugene Peterson, I've been reading through his biography and really enjoying it. So the previous year, I went on a quest with some buddies and read through the Bible cover to cover, which took about 18 months or so to do, and found it really like some highs in it, some lows in it, some confusion in it. Like, it wasn't like this just Yahoo experience. I'm really glad I've done it, and it has like deepened my spiritual life. Eugene Peterson's translation of the Message, though, I find super fascinating. He's a 30-year pastor. He's now gone and deceased, but I've been really enjoying getting to know him more beyond just the scriptures that he translated, but really the life that he lived. And what an imperfect guy he was, which is really helpful. Like, he drank a lot of whiskey, bourbon, and repeatedly in his journals talked about, man, I really shouldn't drink so much. And I'm like, I relate. Yeah, I relate to being imperfect or having one too many bourbons in my journal. So I've been really enjoying playing with getting to know him and taking him with me on a mountain bike ride and listening to an audiobook, and then going back and listening to some of those other books. So yeah, just finding him like a really interesting guy, and love how his experiences of life and his upbringing really, I find in the scriptures, in the translations that he offered, and I find it way more accessible. And he talks about how the life of God is available to us in dinner tables and parking lots, in hospital rooms and boardrooms, and he calls it the soiled ordinariness of our lives. So I just find he's that way, Montana preacher, and his dad was a butcher growing up in a small town, and he said he really always had a heart for misfits, which I do as well.
Yeah. Ironically, I just started the biography.
Oh, nice. Bringing his balance. Yeah.
Nice. And I'm curious. So one of the things that struck me in the book was, I'm only at, I think, chapter 4, but his reflection on that when he would follow his mom and she would preach in these small towns, and it was all men of all these, misfits. He reflected on his dad's butcher shop, all misfits. He reflected on his uncle. I think his name was Sven. Reflected on him, and all of those experiences shaped him as a man, as a pastor. And I'm wondering this idea of misfits, and I've been wondering about it for myself, but I'm wondering, in your work in the world, what's the impact of these misfits that you get to surround yourself with, these leaders and of all sorts? I'm wondering, is there a connection there?
Yeah, that's a great question. I find I'm fascinated by just the outsiders, the misfits, the fringe, and probably because I myself years ago would notice, and I still notice it regularly now, this lack of feeling of like I belong. And wherever I was, whatever room I was in, whatever group I was with, whatever experience I was on, I would just kind of scan the room and just notice like, it's like I'm here and I am invited to be here, or I'm somehow included or permitted, but it's like, I really don't feel like these are my people fully, or I'm like them, but unlike them. And I would notice that no matter where I was, that reoccurring feeling or sense would reoccur in my experience and my interpretation of it. And what I learned to interpret that as is that I belong everywhere. And that's a very different experience than the narrative of I belong nowhere. And with that, what I find is I can wear, and I've joked, I can go to a tuxedo party at night, and I could have slept in the gravel parking lot and not brushed my teeth for a week the morning of. And I could be in VIP rooms and boardrooms, and I can be in the circle of recovery of addicts who are 2 hours sober and homeless. And that can happen for me all in the same day. I can be with mountaineers and climbers. I can be with hunters. I can be with financial analysts. I can be with scientists. I can be with grieving mothers. And for me, what I've noticed now is that feeling of being the outsider is more common than I knew, and that it isn't a personal experience that only I have, that many people have, even when you are a quote unquote insider. So it just helped me develop a much broader view of who is the insider, and more of, I believe we're all insiders. And this whole notion of being a misfit or an outsider just perpetuates that in ways that are super unhelpful. So I tend to, whether it's in the work I do or the neighborhood I live in, I tend to focus most on likeness. And one of the books I'm reading is about kinship, about the we, about the usness. And when we stay in a place of awe and curiosity, we can stay in a place of kinship and belonging. And when we move to a place of judgment and otherness of the differences, that it creates separation in ways that just perpetuate a world that we don't want to inhabit.
Is that an idea that has legs for your clients in the organizations that they lead?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, kinship and we-ness, the we is much more empowering way to operate and to work. You know, there was a time in the world where I could do a lot, meaning I is just a figure of speech of like the very individual contributor, the one leader who's up front, the big innovator everybody wants to follow. Like that took us a long way. And the challenge for today is that we're facing challenges where that old kind of leadership is embodied in a few individuals, and command and control from the smartest people on top telling everybody else what to do and how to do it and when to do it. That used to work in a world that was more certain, facing challenges that were more addressable. And now we live in a world where uncertainty is rampant. The pace of change and complexity increases by the 6 months, and our inability to predict what will happen 6 months from now, from wars to pandemics to employee well-being at a human level, increases. So that means we have to find a way to come together, because no single one of us, there's not enough smart people, whatever that was before, that can solve these challenges in front of us. And the more we come together in kinship to unite together around our likeness and to operate where we're coming together with the collective whole. The great quote I love is like, you want to go fast, go alone. If you want to go far, go together. And I think more and more I'm finding personally, and my experience professionally, is going together is much more gratifying, and the outcomes and the impact and the journey is much more enjoyable, with higher probability of what we come up with collectively will be much better than you and I end up putting our heads together in our best ideas alone.
It feels like to me, Aaron, for many leaders, and I'll include myself in what I'm about to reflect on, that there's a pretty significant fence that needs to be hopped. Like, it makes sense. What you're saying makes sense. I mean, there's probably bumper stickers, if you want to go fast, go alone. If you want to go far, go together. So it all makes sense. But it feels to me like because I've become a hyper individualistic guy. So it feels like a pretty significant fence to hop to get to what you just described. And I'm sure it's a different story for every person who wants to make that journey, who sees the fence and wants to hop it. But I'm wondering what's required of a person to get from the I to the we.
Yeah, I think it's a great question, and I won't claim an answer. I can just share my experiences and journey of being in process myself. The I that I've lived a long time in is very rooted in what I can create, what I can do, the rewards I can have, the power and the influence I can wield and reign. So that David Brooks, in his book, Second Mountain, calls it basically their first mountain endeavors and pursuits, which is very in pursuit of our own ego. And everyone goes on that journey. A lot of that journey was driven for me by, can I do this? Can I go on this quest to prove to myself I can get this kind of job, can have this kind of title, can make this kind of money? If it was personally, can I do an Ironman triathlon and get to the finish line? This whole long list. Can I marry a beautiful woman? Can I have a lovely family? Like, they're all great things. Oftentimes what happens when people arrive at the top of the first mountain, either they find that it's pretty lonely, it's not that great at the top, the cost they paid wasn't worth the rewards that were waiting, and occasionally some people on their quest for the first mountain quit, get blown off, or decide early on this isn't for them. And so he talks about how in the second mountain, which is more of a purpose and passion place of pursuit, where it's actually, there's more joy, there's more intimacy, there's more connection, there's more adventure, there's more curiosity, there's more play, there's a light and easy. That doesn't mean life is easy. It just means that the pursuit is not so egocentric, but it is much more of a communal what impact we can create together. And that is much more sustainable. There are plenty of people, and David Brooks talks about this too, you can tell when you go to a cocktail party, what kind of people are having the conversation around the cocktail party. First mountain people talk about cars, boob jobs. I've been to a lot of these, like what they had for dinner, how much their bonus just was, the party they just went to, the big deal that they are in their world. I find it just nauseating. Second mountain people talk about the difference that they're making. They talk about, like your questions, the hardships they're facing. They talk about the things in the world that trouble them that they're engaged in, not just reading about on a headlines. And so oftentimes that second mountain quest is the pursuit of purpose, joy, meaning, and impact. And that we can't do alone. And it's no longer an egocentric I story, but it is a we story. And so I find personally, for me, where I'm at in my life is that second mountain isn't ever one that I get to the top of. It's more of a journey and about pursuit. And in that, I now know through humility, suffering, setbacks, all those things, that the first mountain is fine. For some, it was fine for me until it wasn't. And now I'm expending my energy towards what would it look like to come together, not just me on a personal quest to prove that I'm worthy of belonging.
Mm. It feels like to me, Aaron, that Brooks did a beautiful job of describing these two mountains and his own story of going from mountain one, the first mountain, to the second. Your book, Fire Your Boss, feels correct me if I've missed it, but having reread it just this week in preparation for our time together, it feels like a map from mountain one to mountain two.
Yeah, for sure.
Is that?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. So my book, when I wrote it, was a period of about 10 years of writing it, from kind of the early chicken scratch out on my back patio to the actual what's published today and available. And I didn't know that's what it was at the time. But I realized it was like a blueprint or a map for how to move from, just this daily grind of, I got to get up and go to work. I got to survive. I got to manage my life, to, and all those things that come with the first mountain, to then the wilderness that exists between the two mountains. And I liken that with Joseph Campbell's work of the hero's journey. Richard Rohr has a book called Falling Upward, which is about the second half of life spirituality. So all very similar storylines, but how do you move from the first mountain through the wilderness and onto the second mountain? And oftentimes, second mountain doesn't require you, and David Brooks talks about this in his book again, you don't have to, or I talk about it in mine as well, you don't actually have to change where you are. You can begin to operate in your life, with your family, with your friends, in your neighborhood, in your career, in your team, with your friends, with your colleagues, in more purposeful, meaningful, kinship, second mountain ways. You don't have to renovate everything and pick up and go get a new career. But it does require starting to renovate how you operate where you are, what you believe, and then from those deep held beliefs, then you operationalize the behaviors and choices and value system that you hold into the behaviors of your daily work and your daily life, so that there's congruence between the two. And that, to me, is a lot of what my book is about.
And I even feel myself relax as you describe that. I mean, I've now read your book in full twice, and then in parts probably a couple more times. And not that I felt a lot of pressure, but even just as you're describing that, I feel a relaxing in my shoulders. It's like it's not about moving from mountain one to mountain two, like physically moving location, so to speak, but it's a mindset to live in a second mountain way. You're on the same plot of land, but it's how, it's the why and the how. The what may remain the same, but it's the why and the how that make that shift, to co-op our friend Simon Sinek's.
Yeah.
Is that?
Yeah. Fundamentally, I think that most of us, me included, it's easy to fall into the story and the narrative that we tell ourselves is, my work would be great if only fill in the blank. You and I have had this conversation before. If only my boss wasn't such a jerk. If only, my company let me work remote 2 more days a week than they do. If it's like this long list, and it's like, if only, if only, if only, if only. And that becomes I was just reading a friend's blog post about just, that's a very victim mentality, where it's, I don't have agency and choice here. So I'm beholden to whatever structure, construct, and then I have to find a way to kind of, unfortunately, what a lot of people do is they figure out a way to offer the least amount of themselves in the life that they live. And that's the coping mechanism for the circumstances they find themselves in. And so I've had a lot of these conversations, I'm sure you have too, when people use phrases like, thank God it's Friday, today is hump day, don't work too hard. Like, to me, all that stuff is just rooted in this like concept of, for the next 30 to 40 years of our career, the objective is to survive it, just get through it, so that you can end up in the happily ever after called retirement or whatever that is. I find it a really sad story, because then the alternatives are to show up to your work, pretend that part of you can be half asleep, pretend that part of you can be totally not engaged, disengaged, partially engaged, and that's not going to affect the rest of your life, that you'll be able to just contain it to how you are in your working life. it's such a farce. Whereas the contrast is, what would it look like to show up fully, awake, alive, alert, engaged, wholehearted in the work that you have, the life that you have, with the human beings entrusted to your care and your relationships. And for me, that's a much more compelling, interesting story to live into. I'll read you a quote from St. Paul. It's one of my favorites. And he wrote, "Make a careful exploration of who you are and the work that you've been given." Make a careful exploration of who you are and the work that you've been given. And then sink yourself into that. Don't be impressed with yourself. Don't compare yourself with others. Each of you must take responsibility for doing the creative best with your own life. And to me, that's the invitation of a second mountain. And to your point earlier is like, how do you do that? I don't know. I think it takes a lifetime. I don't think it's like just an easy, here's 10 easy steps to doing the creative best with your own life. Because I think they differ and they're unique to each of us. But I believe it starts with believing we have something here to do. There's something here for us. That today, this day we've been given, that we're entrusted with today. So how do we want to steward that with the gifting that we have, with the challenges that we have, the setbacks we have, with our education, with our where we live, with all those things? There's resources, there's liabilities, there's disappointments, and there's hopes. But how do we step fully into today so that we can actually, I believe, co-author in partnership with God a life and work and impact that we're proud of?
One of the things, Aaron, that I love in the book is, and you say it a couple times, like, I'm not going to talk more about this. I'm going to tell you a story. And so redacting the names for confidentiality's sake, I'm curious, is there a recent story of someone in the world, doesn't even have to be a client, but just someone you've walked with, who maybe some would say, well, that's a lost cause. He's stuck on the first mountain. He'll never get off the first mountain. And now he or she is slow but sure, either has made the shift to a second mountain way of living or is in process. Is there a story that stands out to you?
Yeah, I guess the one that jumps off the page in my mind to me is, I had a conversation maybe this summer with a senior leader, and I want to say maybe it was around like 4th of July or something. And so there was a couple days off that were built in, and we were having a one-on-one coaching session. I work with their broader team of leaders. And so this one was just he and I. And during the course of the conversation, he was talking about how much different he felt this particular week because he had left work early, went and played golf, I want to say, with his college daughter who was home, and then ended up the following day having off and then having a shared meal with his family. It was noticing, wow, I feel substantially more myself from just these like 36 hours of a more sustainable pace, contrasted by the normal, we'll just call them 14-hour days, back-to-back meetings, high intensity, lots of crisis and firefighting, lots of drama, not like people being, I don't mean like a TV show drama, but I mean like high stakes things that are happening all the time, real stressful every day. So what was cool, we had a conversation is, and how might you if that's what's bringing you life and you feel more yourself, you feel more creative, more patient, more curious, those things would no doubt serve you day to day in these challenges you're facing, right? Yep, agreed. So how could you build in some more of these practices so that you can recharge your engine? And how can you renew along the way versus defer renewal all the time to weekends and holidays? And he said, like, I don't know, and I don't know that I really want to have the conversation because I'm afraid that the answers are scary. And the conversation kind of went something like, well, it's not like I can quit my job. You know, I got a mortgage and I got kids in college. It was like a kind of reactive, like defensive. This is impossible. You don't understand. And I said, could we just agree? I have a mortgage. I have kids in college. I'm paying for, you know, straight teeth from orthodontists to retirement funds. Like we're actually peers. Would you be willing? And he went on to say something along the lines of, it's been a while since I had a brave conversation with myself. Okay. What would that brave conversation, where would it start? And where it started was, well, if I had it, if I was brave enough to have it, I would start to evaluate, well, what are some of my values? What are the things that are actually important to me? And it turns out dinner with the family, a golf outing at 4 p.m. with a buddy on a summer day, like they're actually kind of small asks, but not when you live in a state of overwhelmed and not when the context that you're in is so intense for so long and prolonged that it feels like it's a violation of culture when you're the only one stepping out of it. You're the only one playing golf at 4. But there's a great quote from Greg McHugh that he wrote the book Essentialism, The Disciplined Pursuit of Less. And he writes that if you don't prioritize your life, someone else will. And I think that part of what begins to look at how do we move into more sustainable pursuits of what I would call like soulful, wholehearted living, second mountain living, is we do have to get really clear on what are the things we hold as valuable, and then what are the priorities that we create in our life, because most of us are living in shoulds, in have-tos, and that just depletes us. One of the stats I just pulled this morning around burnout was stress, anxiety, and burnout are at an all-time high. So from American Psychological Association, Deloitte's burnout survey, and one other source, it says between 40 and 70% of employees have experienced burnout at their current jobs. 60% of employees reported negative impacts of work-related stress, including lack of interest, motivation, or energy, a lack of effort at work, cognitive weariness, emotional and physical fatigue and exhaustion. That's not good. So what that's really saying is less than 30% of us are finding a way to live in a place of wellness. Well, what are those 30% doing? I suspect they have prioritized their values in ways, and that doesn't mean to say that they're simple or easy, but I think that's a first step forward, and that can be the beginning of the map of the path to much more of a sustainable way to live and love.
So that conversation, that work with that leader, it's almost 6 months ago. How's he doing?
Yeah, I think it's stories to be told. I've witnessed some really positive shifts. I've witnessed some really courageous moments in conversation, witnessing that person in the team speaking up, and speaking up with much more courage and credibility in saying some really hard things that the team needs to hear in the spirit of like kinship and we-ness. And it's been really inspiring. Whether there's golf on Fridays, and dinners at home, I'm not sure, but I would say directionally, I'm seeing a more courageous, centered, wholehearted person showing up more frequently.
And that's one of the ideas that you talk about in the book is direction, not destination. And 1 degree, 2 degree shifts. And again, that's really kind. There's a lot of kindness in your book.
Nice.
And in this conversation, it's kind. It's okay. Just shift direction. And a 1 degree shift in direction may not seem like a lot today, but if you keep going and only with a 1 degree shift of direction, you're going to be in a different place than maybe where you were originally thought you were going. And that can be massive.
Yeah. I love that, Jeff. I'm a big believer in experiments. Like, I love the spirit of experimentation, and I love the invitation which was given to me around 2 degree shifts. And the story that I shared in the book and was told by a friend is he was a FedEx pilot, and he's like, oh, let me just tell you, like, the difference of 2 degrees when you're flying from Los Angeles to Hawaii, he said, is when you're actually a pilot, you don't just lock in the course, because you're constantly adjusting 2 degrees, 3 degrees, 5 degrees, constantly. So he's like, the difference of 2 degrees from Los Angeles to Hawaii was like 80 miles. He's like, you will entirely miss the Hawaiian Islands if you don't constantly course correct along the way. But 2 degrees played out over whatever it is, 2,900 miles or something like that. He goes, it's a really big delta in intended destination and being off course, lost at sea. And I find that really helpful because it's like, well, if you operationalize that in a today, I remember when I came back after an intense week away of like deep, soulful exploration and therapy, it was like, how the hell do I get started? How do I begin to step into right now what I just learned that I want to begin to bring to life in my life and career and relationships? And they said that it's to start with two degrees. They said, start in the conversation that you're in right now. What's the conversation that you would have without doing any kind of adjustment? I'm like, oh yeah, well, I would play it safe. I was on a podcast earlier today, and in my head, I was like, if they go down this path of like very like linear, logical, fact-based, that we could burn the whole time, that the 2 degree shift for me is to make sure I bring my whole heart into it and offer that, and let's see if they follow. But it was a risk on my part. And to me, it was in the moment, in the conversation, willing to vulnerably risk sharing more of myself than just facts and data. Those are the ways where you begin to operationalize, because it's at the micro level, and it's in the moment, it's in the conversation, it's in the day, it's in the email, it's all these things. And I think that to me is, they're each of them are experiments, because you don't know how they're going to go. I don't know. When I bring this up on this other podcast, are they going to think, oh my gosh, who is this guy? Like, we didn't ask for Dr. Phil, or whatever. I don't know. But so I think over time, by running continual experiments and trying something, we begin to build more muscle in areas that we will create more of the outcomes of the moment, because the connection that we seek. And for me, I desire to have my life rich and deeply soaked in grace, love, connection, adventure. And for me, I was really frustrated by how little of that I experienced before. And I found that I was It started with me.
Uh, yeah, I love this personal responsibility piece. You gave a bunch of statistics earlier about burnout. In your book, you talk about Gallup's annual survey of engagement and disengagement. And most of the time, and I'll admit, I have stood in front of a group of people and quoted those statistics, and I have said, this falls at the feet of leadership. And there is certainly, there certainly is a great deal of responsibility of leadership. But I think what you are pointing to is, well, what am I willing to do? What is the employee who is disengaged willing to do? Is he or she a victim of disengagement or of what management is or is not doing? And you can, whatever organization someone finds themselves in, a family, a company, a small business. And so it really, calling, in my note to you in the email, I said, calling BS on Gallup survey. It wasn't really calling BS on their survey. It's calling BS on absolving myself completely of any responsibility of being engaged or disengaged.
Yeah.
I really love the invitation to have a brave conversation with myself about, well, what's my responsibility here?
Yeah. Let's do that now. So for you, the listener, I invite you to come in close. Lean in. Lean into this conversation. And ask yourself, when was the last time you had a brave conversation with yourself? When did you take a drive, leave the phone behind? When did you linger, look yourself in the mirror? When did you wonder about your experience of your life, your career? Not the LinkedIn side of the story, but the actual inside of what it's like to be you story. How's it going? Where's it going great? And where are there gaps that you have outsourced the responsibility, that the reason those gaps exist, according to the story that you might tell yourself, is because of others? And in that place of disempowerment, then the only plan for anything to be better is if someone else will do the following according to your script. And I encourage you that another way to consider is, what if you expended your energy on learning to lead yourself more effectively? Being led by others is wonderful, can be a really lovely experience. It can also be a really frustrating experience. And each of us have had both. But for each of us, the way forward is to learn to lead and love ourselves in new ways. And we can take back the autonomy that we choose. We can take back more of the ownership and empowerment that we choose. And we can begin to take more seriously our own agency and authorship that we're entrusted with, so that we can have more of us available in the moment, in the conversation, with the colleagues that we lead, the projects that we're entrusted with the family, friends, relationships that we have. But that's been a missing link for me for a long time. Is there's enough talk about what leadership can do, needs to do. Yes, they should keep, whoever they are, they should keep doing that. And also, how might we step up and step forward?
That, Aaron, is a conversation that leaders aren't having. the title of of the podcast. And the one question, and it's probably a big question to here at the end of our time together, is, you know, the name of your book, Fire Your Boss. There's an assumption that there is a boss, and you know, one of the audience, one of the those that listen to this podcast they're the boss, they're the CEO. There is no boss to fire. Well, I guess the board, you could say the board is their boss. But I'm wondering, how is the invitation that you just gave to our listeners, is it equally for that CEO who doesn't have a boss, who can only look at him or herself?
Yeah, great question.
Is that the same conversation?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that part of the challenge of the title is it's deeply metaphor. And so the metaphor is the subtitle of the book is Discover Work That You Love Without Quitting Your Job, which is another way of saying renovate everything where you are. So by stepping up and leading yourself, so whatever your role and title is, you are accountable to others. If you're the CEO, you're accountable to the board. If you're the board, you're accountable to shareholders. So everyone has a figurative and mythical other, person or group where there's accountability, responsibility. And it's very common in the world of work for us to tell stories about how my current experience of this would be easier, better, if only so-and-so would do more of or less of the following. And my intention in the book title is to say, okay, that's fine. But what if instead you renovate how you do what you do where you are? That applies to any and all titles and roles. And it's very, very, very common for us to say, I would if only. And my invitation is, let's change the conversation. Let's change the conversation around, was with another team this week. They were doing some well-being report out with a town hall. And they had some lovely slides they were going to share with some facts and stats and quotes. And we started with, hold on, let's go back and ask the question, what's the impact and what's the outcome you want to have with these 150 people? You're about to play back to them this pretty unfortunate set of results that are the truth that they're experiencing of what it means to come to work here every day. So we had a totally different conversation. It was like, whoa, who cares what's on the slide? Let's talk about what do we want them to feel like walking out of this 1 hour town hall. Well, we want them to feel like we heard them. We want them to feel like we're listening. We want them to feel like we have some personal accountability and responsibility in this, and here's some things we're going to try and do differently. Like, great. So let's worry about what the slide says later, but let's land these 3 or 4 key things, and then we can move into, and then how do we bring that to life in a 1 hour town hall? So with that, for me, all of this is rooted deeply in, for me, like, I believe God's with us. I believe we're not alone. I believe people matter. And I believe that we're here to do something not just about our own personal conquests and achievement, which is every one of us do that. That's great. But how do we turn that into superpowers that we can wield in service of others so that we can have even greater impact, so that we can have legacy that we're proud of? And for me, I want to help create a world that my grandchildren will inhabit, that I will have had something to do with improving and making better, through the impact of leaders like you that are listening.
Thank you, Aaron.
Yeah,
This has been a thrill for me, and just another time I'll share how much of a service it is for me personally, just to hear you talk and to share some of your experience. So I deeply, deeply appreciate it. And if we're going to put where the people can find you, we'll put links to your book. We're going to also put some links to the book, The Second Mountain, Essentialism, and Burning in My Bones, the Peterson. I'll put all those. Is there any other way that we could direct people if they want to know more about you?
Yeah, my podcast is Work Life Play. You can look it up wherever you digest and consume podcasts. You can Google search Work Life Play, and you'll find myself and my blog, website, field reports, adventure trips, all kinds of fun stuff there. And yeah, what it looks like to be a wholehearted human and how that shows up in all categories of work, life, and play. So thanks for having me on today, Jeff.
Yeah, a lot of fun. Thank you so much. Deeply meaningful.
Yeah, you too, brother. Thanks.